Welcome. If you're new here, my name is Greg Ferris, founder of MyoBrain. In today's video, we're going to be discussing 5 strategies you can use to stay lean all while eating out. So before we jump into it, talk about the 2 different reasons why we're making this video. We are now 10 years into providing online nutrition coaching for various individuals, and time again it comes up that eating meals away from home is a huge struggle. So a ton of our content is teaching people how to navigate those situations. The second thing, a lot of this is going to be more of an art than a science. You can't perfect something like eating out when there's imperfection built into the system. So think of all the methods we'll talk about today as tools in your toolbox. You may use 1 or 2 of them, and the others you'll never use. But again, the more information we can have you come to the table with, the more prepared you're going to be in a variety of situations. And lastly, before we get into the meat of the video, let's do a quick recap of the foundations of how we can track any meal away from home. There's really 2 different methods we've touched upon in previous videos. The first method is to track the exact food, or kind of a carbon copy if it's a mom and pop style shop. The second item we'll want to think about there is to make sure we pre-log that meal. So say for example, if I'm going to go get burgers and fries with some friends on a Friday evening, Friday morning, I will pre-log that meal, say a bacon cheeseburger and sweet potato fry. That way I have the calories set aside and I don't have to worry about maybe I have room for it or maybe I don't. And again, if you're going to a chain restaurant, a McDonald's, a Chick-fil-A, a Chipotle, that information should be available on whatever nutrition tracking app you're using. If you're going to a local spot, the best rule of thumb is to think of a chain that's comparable and pick something similar. Try not to stress about it too much. Speaking of stress, the upside of this technique is obviously it's going to be the most accurate way we can gauge a meal out. Not perfect indeed, but it's going to be the closest thing to perfect. The downsides of this method, however, it can be a little bit stressful. You may not know exactly the cut of beef that they're using. You may not know the portion sizes exactly. So some people can get a little bit anxious in these situations. That bleeds into our second method. We introduced this idea to our clients roughly a year ago, and we titled the video Stress-Free Tracking Meals Out. Instead of saying, okay, I think it's a cup of rice and 6 ounces of chicken, etc., instead we give people a calorie allotment, roughly 600 to 800 for women or 800 to 1,000 for men, and all they would do is pre-log that meal. So you can go into MyFitnessPal, track 1,000 calories for dinner, submit, and it's over. You don't have to worry about exactly what you're eating. So obviously the upside with this method is it's super simple and it takes you about 15 seconds. The downside, of course, it's going to be a lot less accurate than directly measuring the meal, even if that's an estimate. The other downside we've seen sometimes with this method, there's not really any accountability built into this. So say for example, you could plug in that 1,000 calories, but then go have several drinks, several appetizers, and eat well over that. So you want to think about, okay, I've set those calories aside, but I'm still going to be reasonable, not use it as an excuse to try to, overfeed yourself and get away with it, if you will. Okay, let's now jump into our 5 different strategies you can implement to stay lean all while eating out. Also, again, keep in mind here, you may use some of these tools, may not use others. Think of it as tools in your toolbox. Some of these methods may even contradict one another. So it doesn't mean that you have to use any of them. They're just trying to arm you with information. So jumping off with number 1, tip number 1 here, only allow yourself to splurge on a single item. So say if you go and eat out, you of course have alcohol, appetizers, entree, desserts. All of those can be potentially hazardous. So a simple heuristic here is I'm going to indulge in one of those and keep everything else very basic. So the example I have down, say if you want to go to a place and get a whiskey and Coke, no problem with that, but that means you maybe need to get a sirloin steak and a vegetable. Keep the meal relatively low calorie. Or the opposite, maybe you went to a place and you want to get their famous lobster mac and cheese indulge in that, but that's fine. No crazy appetizers, and you get a water for a beverage. You see how this can balance itself out, and it's very simple to think about. Final thing on this point, this is something we teach people around the holiday season that I think can apply here, and the mindset is to take what you love and leave what you like. So of course, there's probably gonna be a lot of different options of fun foods you can eat when you go to a restaurant, but think about what you actually went there for. Do they have the best cocktails, or do they have a crazy dessert? Whatever it is, and indulge in that. But if they have maybe a couple of things that are okay but not amazing, that's the stuff you can set aside and get something a little bit healthier there. So remember that phrase, take what you love, leave what you like. Okay, moving on to method 2. This is nothing groundbreaking, but still a very effective method to save some calories, and that is to split your entree with someone else. Why do we do this? There was a study by Tufts University. They found that the average fast food meal, just the entree, had almost 800 calories. And then the average sit-down meal had almost 1,300 calories. Again, just the entrees here. So if we know it's not hard at all to put down, say, 1,000 calories at a meal, again, a very easy heuristic here is to chop that in half and split that with someone else. Of course, having leftovers can be a very similar strategy here, although that can be problematic because you have to have the discipline to not overeat in the moment. So I really do prefer the splitting the meals. It's simple, it can be decided beforehand, and it really does create some sort of friction between you and a bad decision. Another method I like to personally use is maybe we'll get one appetizer and one entree, and again, collectively eat that. So maybe it's a little bit more calories than just splitting, but also allows me to stay full from the overall meal. And method number 3, we're gonna be using an infographic here because there's a lot of numbers that can get a little bit convoluted, but method 3 is to pull calories from other meals to make room for that higher calorie meal out. I wanna be clear here as well. If you have kind of a history with binge eating, so you have some over restriction, overeating cycles, this is probably not a wise method for you to use, but again, we have other methods you can experiment with. So again, the idea here is, say if we have an example I'll have on the screen where you maybe split your calories on a typical day between 5 meals. You have 2,000 calories between 5 meals. I think the example I'll have was like 400 for breakfast, 400 for lunch, 300 for a snack, 600 for a dinner, and 300 for a snack. So a high eating frequency, that's fine if you know where everything's coming from and you can be confident those are your true calories. However, if we're gonna have a meal with, again, 1,000 plus calories, which is likely if we're gonna go out to eat, we need to find some more room for that. So again, in our example here, we cut the PM snack entirely. That gives you 300 calories back. And we also pulled 300 calories away from breakfast, took it from 400 to 100. So when you do that, it's pretty simple. You shift all of that now to dinner and you have a much bigger room to play with. I think roughly 1,200 calories for this meal. And of course, there's endless ways you can experiment with this, but the whole idea is, okay, if I know I'm gonna have an expensive item, say for dinner, I can just pull from here, pull from there, and make the math work. Again, this is really why it's important to pre-log the meal, because if you do this ahead of time, you have that 1,200 set aside. Now you can kind of retroactively cut some from lunch, cut some from breakfast, etc., to make sure you're gonna stay on track. Okay, so now moving on to tip number 4, which does a little bit contradict method number 3. So again, that's why these are tools in a toolbox, but number 4 is to eat a high protein snack roughly 30 to 60 minutes before the meal out. This is particularly useful for more kind of buffet styles. Think graduation barbecues, 4th of Julys, or even restaurants that have free food, where it's really easy to overindulge, chips and salsa, maybe a bread and olive oil. If we have a high protein snack going into that, in kind of a close proximity, you really can downshift your hunger. Maybe you were gonna be a 6 hunger going into that. Now you have a protein shake, you get your hunger to a 3. Now we're a lot less likely to overindulge in those snacky kind of small bite items, which can add up. To put some numbers to this, again, rough guidelines here, But if your protein intake is under 150 grams on a daily basis, you probably can have a shake around 20 to 30 grams or roughly 1 scoop of a high quality protein powder. If your daily protein intake is above 150 grams, I recommend about 30 to 50 grams of protein, again, about 30 to 60 minutes before that meal, just to kind of blunt our hunger and again, create friction between us and a bad decision. All right, and this final tip is gonna be more of a mindset piece and also specifically targeted people that may eat out with a high frequency. But tip number 5 is eating out is not permission to always treat yourself. So in the example I'm gonna give here, again, targeted to people who may eat out 4, 5, 6+ times per week. If we think about how often, like what percent of your meals or your calorie intake may come from outside the home, it could be 10 or 20% of the entire week. You really can't afford to just mail it in 10 or 20% of the time and likely still get lean or stay lean. The analogy that came to my head here is, think if you were trying to get a good exam score in college, and if you were late to the class, the professor said, hey, if anybody is 5 minutes late, you immediately start with an 80% on your exam. And say you show up late and say, okay, 20% deducted, you can still pass the class, you can get everything right, maybe you get a 75, 80%, but you have almost no room for error, right? You have to really, really make sure everything else is picture perfect. You better have studied hard. So that's a similar situation. If we mail it in 5, 6 times a week, that gives you almost no room for error if you really want to control your calories. So instead, what I recommend here, if you're the person, if you travel a lot, you do try to eat, you do have a lifestyle where you eat out quite a bit, think of giving yourself 1 or 2 kind of meals where you can treat yourself. Maybe it's a Friday night, it's a Sunday morning. That's the time you're actually going to indulge a little bit. But say if it's like a Tuesday afternoon and you're just getting lunch somewhere, that needs to be pretty similar to what you would have at home. So you go to Chipotle and get a chicken bowl with no queso, because that's maybe something you would have at home. Again, we can't think of every scenario as, oh yeah, this restaurant's so good, I'm gonna get this here, I'm gonna get the ice cream there. Even though you may be tempted to do that, because a lot of us do associate eating out with eating fun foods, if, again, a big chunk of our overall weekly intakes and they come from that, we have to recreate good meals as much as possible. Again, if you shift maybe 1 or 2 meals, that's okay. And then obviously, if your meals out are generally low, you only eat out once or twice a week, you have a lot more room for error because maybe it's 1 to 5% of your overall weekly intake. Okay, and that is volume 1 of our first round of tips for staying lean while eating out. Again, a quick review here. Number 1, allow yourself only 1 splurge item. Tip number 2, split a meal or take leftovers. I really recommend splitting meals. Number 3, allocate your calories, pull them away from other meals to make room for that higher calorie one. Tip number 4, have a high protein snack, roughly 30 to 60 minutes. I recommend a protein shake. And then tip number 5, if you have a high eating out frequency, every time you eat out is not permission to treat yourself. Limit that to maybe once or twice per week. If you have any questions, you can always contact me at myobraincoaching@gmail.com. As many of you know, we do offer direct one-on-one coaching. Again, we'll leave that link in the bio. Other than that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.